Welcome to Sage for H, and welcome to the IR PhD interview series. In this interview series, the idea is to get into the life world of PhD students who are doing or recently finished their doctoral projects in IR. Today, I have the honor to speak to Bianca Freeman. Bianca is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at UC San Diego. She studies the politics of race in international law and intervention. Bianca's research program asks, how does racial hierarchy shape international law? Despite conventional assumptions about formal equality between sovereign states, Bianca studies international law as patterns of exclusion from which race is a key organizing principle. Her dissertation and book project examine US status of forces agreements and the responsibility to protect as legal outcomes of racial hierarchy in world politics. Bianca has published in the Annual Review of Political Science, and the hope is that we will get to discuss that really nice article as well. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. It really is a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Thank you for participating. It's really nice to have you. I hope everything is well on your side.
Yes, everything is well. I think maybe winding down a little bit for the holiday season after a very busy quarter. But I hope everything is well on your end of things too.
Yeah, it's quite late over here. It's 8:30, so my kids just went to bed. And it's dark outside and it's very cold, actually. Maybe you've heard about that, the energy crisis in Europe.
Yes,
so the heating is not on.
Yeah, it's we've been getting so much rain here lately in sunny Southern California, and the temperature has dropped quite a bit. But I cannot complain.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get down to business, so to speak. And let's get into your life world as a PhD. So the first question I normally ask is a basic, straightforward and clear question in terms of it being quite short, but perhaps not so easy to answer. So why did you want to do a PhD in the first place?
So part of the draw of the idea of a PhD for me was very much about being in the classroom. So there was always something about the university setting, the rigor, the ideas that really clicked with me early on in my education. So as a college student, I felt that entering a classroom was sort of like accepting the standing invitation to learn and to be curious and to engage in interesting theories and stories about how the world works, no matter the discipline. So for me, the pursuit of study wasn't as much about making certain grades. I didn't always know that I wanted to pursue an advanced degree, as it was about being challenged and getting to be creative. I didn't know at the time, but I think that this approach served me well in preparation for a PhD. So today I can see how it anchors me in both the easier and the more difficult seasons of research and teaching. Ultimately, and to your initial question, I made the decision to apply to a PhD because I wanted training to become a professor. I saw it as one possible way of facilitating the type of active learning that I was fortunate to receive at UC Riverside first and now at UC San Diego. A big part of this goal still for me is a commitment to normalizing and growing a more inclusive intellectual environment, specifically at the more critical points in the academic pipeline, as well as scholarship that more closely reflects the world around us. And once I arrived at UC San Diego, I quickly learned how this kind of motivation is well received and kind of nurtured there. So it was a pretty natural fit for me.
Okay, cool. So when you say classroom, has it always been like that from the very first classroom? I mean, since you were very young, or is it something that are you referring to a university classroom, this idea and this curiosity and this intellectual stimulation and so on? Is it starting from the university classroom, or is something that was part of you growing up as a child?
Well, I think I can recall back to the more kind of primary years of education, even before university. I was just naturally curious, and I think drawn to things that had a more like international or kind of global context or implications. But even before kind of my subject area interests developed, I think that just being in the classroom and getting to engage in texts and discuss and debate ideas. And just for me, it was less perhaps academic and more about understanding and formulating how I saw the world and learning how others around me saw the world, and how these worldviews often reflected their backgrounds and their communities and their experiences. And so there was just something about that that I always felt was important, just normatively. And I enjoyed watching classmates and TAs and professors, especially once I entered college. I enjoyed getting to see that in them as well. So yeah, I think it was just, even though I didn't always know that I would pursue a PhD or what I would do with it ultimately, I think that just it was a place where it just clicked with me, just being there operating in the classroom setting specifically.
Interesting. And this leads me to the second question. What do you love about IR? Why is IR so special?
Why is IR so special? That's a good question. So I mentioned that early on in school, I seemed to be drawn to puzzles that were more global in scale. And so international relations kind of seemed like it was a major, I think, that just made sense for me personally. And I loved the decision to first major in it, and then pursue a PhD with an IR focus. Now being in a PhD program, I think what I enjoy most about IR is getting to grapple with and being in dialogue with research that seeks to explain some of these outcomes that we debate intensely in IR, and they're just things that I care about personally. I think that what I love about IR is what it could be. I think that there's already so much to appreciate about the literature as it stands, but at the same time, I see IR as this glass half full, if you will, where there's room to build upon and design better theories of interstate interaction. And these things, of course, have very real implications for cooperation, for equality, the health of our climate, women's rights, so on and so forth. So, appreciating the opportunity to both advance core IR theory and learn about the history of the field, and to innovate it has been an important aspect of my training in graduate school. And working with my dissertation committee, my advisor, David Lake, and getting to kind of form and interact with this inner subdisciplinary community. So it's a constant look out to, what is next in IR and how can we improve upon what we already have.
So what you love about IR is part of what you love about it is actually what it could be in terms of developing IR, and you're part of that development, perhaps. I don't know if you envision yourself as part of that. I don't know at this stage, but in any case, so is that also then part of why you focus on the issue of race, for instance, in international relations? Because IR as a glass half full has perhaps omitted, intentionally or not, issues such as race and others, and how that affects and shapes the ordering of international relations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's, I've enjoyed so much just figuring grad school out and figuring out what research agenda excites me the most. And I think that race is just on its face for me. It's an important potential explanation for certain outcomes that we observe in world politics. And you're right, it has been omitted, especially in empirical work in IR. And so for me, I think that my interest in the topic of race and the potential that I believe that it holds for understanding world politics in a deeper, ideally more powerful way is what one of the draws for me is. And so, you know, I totally understand and appreciate the fact that it takes a career, really a lifetime, to build out a body of work such that it has the impact to move the field forward in a meaningful way. And so if I can, you know, contribute in a small way to that, then I'll be happy. And and you know, there's a certain sense of satisfaction when you know, what you contribute is helpful for the future of the field, which are, you know, entering PhD students right now.
Yeah. When you say that it has been omitted, you mentioned especially in empirical stuff. Before we get into what your PhD is more specifically about, this is more of a general question.
Sure.
So you mentioned that it has been left out in more empirical studies.
Yes.
Does that implicitly say or mean that it is part of more critical studies already, but there is a void to fill when it comes perhaps to more positivist type of studies, if you see what I'm trying to say here? Is that what I can read
Sure.
into that statement or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
And this is, this is, and I know we'll get into it, but this was some of the motivation for the review piece that's co-authored. I think that there's a whole body of work, whether it's more critical in nature. We talked about the Howard School, which has also been discussed by other IR scholars, and those contributions, not just work that's critical in nature, but actual theorizing of race that certainly can be tested. This has existed for some time now. And I think that it's ideally positivists are now catching on and accepting that we would have to theorize and empirically examine race in order to know whether or not it matters for certain outcomes. So yes, I think that for me personally, it was very important to first acknowledge and really take stock of the work that already exists, both that's a bit older, so in Howard School, work in the late 90s and the 2000s, and scholars that are very much active right now in this race and IR debate. I think that positivists have an opportunity to also make contributions to this specific I guess, opportunity or kind of gap in the literature when it comes to understanding world politics.
Sorry for another follow-up question, because no, okay, yeah. Since you touch upon it, and perhaps this might not be a fair question to ask, because when I was in your position, I was exploring a lot and testing different grounds, and one day I was trying out that, and another day I was trying out that, and one day I was thinking about the world in terms of that ontology, and another day I was thinking about the world in terms of that ontology. But still, but since you bring it up, would you consider yourself more within the positivist camp, so to speak?
I would self-identify in the more kind of positivist approach to the study of race and IR in general. And that's very much what my training in grad school reflects. And I think that when I was preparing to contribute to this review piece and just this conversation of race and IR in general, I think that what I learned from that experience is I think there's a lot in common, even though there's certain epistemologies and methodological approaches that distinguish those two kind of approaches, if you will. But I think that there's a lot of common ground. And I've just had the best time getting to interact with scholars that identify as more critical in nature, that kind of interrogate structures of power where race is very much important and at play. I have loved talking with scholars that approach these questions in a more critical vein. However, I do believe that as someone who who's training or who approaches these questions in a more positivist manner, where empirical examination is important, I do believe that race is just as relevant, and that we can still understand and hopefully capture certain underlying dynamics of power that are racialized. I don't see them as belonging in one or the other necessarily.
No.
And I think that when we talk about the Howard School and we appreciate those contributions, we come to learn that there is always, or since then, there has been a case made that IR needs to think about race, and that there's a potential to examine and to test the theories that are made. But to even get there, empiricists or positivists would have to first think deeply about how race matters, beyond a variable or a control in a regression. Making it central to theory is key. And I see that happening with scholars that take a qualitative approach, a quantitative approach, and then scholars, again, that assess these things more critically.
Okay, interesting. All right, so now to your PhD. The more specific question about your PhD. So what is your PhD about?
So you gave such a nice introduction at the beginning, so I may rephrase some of that, so I'm not sounding too repetitive, but you said it very well. So in my PhD, I study race and international law broadly. So over the term of my program, the specific question that I ask has evolved to how does racial hierarchy, meaning the ordered ranking of states, into vertical relations of super and subordination along the color line shape international law. So despite these conventional assumptions about formal equality between sovereign states, I study international law as patterns of exclusion, from which race, I argue, is a key organizing principle. So in my dissertation and book project, I examine US status of forces agreements and the responsibility to protect, or R2P, as legal outcomes of racial hierarchy in world politics. So I kind of divide this project into two parts. So part one, which is ongoing, it centers the experiences of US military personnel overseas in order to both develop and complicate existing explanations about criminal jurisdiction in status of forces agreements. I'm going to call them SOFAs.
SOFAs.
So I focus.
It's always nice with an abbreviation.
Exactly. So I focus on the extraterritorial application of American law, especially the conditions under which US soldiers are protected from incarceration by the host government. In general, this research program investigates the legal and the institutional dimensions of SOFA that systematically neglect or punish service members of color in host communities of color. So I anchor much of this work in hierarchy theory, a framework for understanding the relationship between racism and bargains over status between the US and host country. This also allows me to consider SOFAs as a site of agency, where racial bias in criminal jurisdiction, though it's codified, is contested. So that's part one. Part two explores race and international intervention, specifically the legal dimensions of intervention. So here I focus on the responsibility to protect, or R2P, which is a legal principle that represents states' collective commitment to atrocity prevention. So in this part of the dissertation, I argue that it is racism and the rhetoric of responsibility that are constitutive of this decision to intervene.
Okay. have you published anything yet? Is this a monograph, or will you publish separate articles and collect them into a PhD? How would it work?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So for me, one of the chapters, or what will ultimately be one of the chapters of this dissertation, I first wrote was my seminar paper. So this in a PhD program is the paper that's typically written in the second year, and it's kind of seen as a PhD student's kind of first go or exposure to building or constructing a research project from the ground up. So what began as my seminar paper kind of evolved into an article and will be one of the chapters of the dissertation. And so
Okay.
this particular chapter, or one of them, is under review right now. And then have shifted focus a bit to the R2P section of the dissertation. So I can, kind of playing it by ear, but I can see publishing certain chapters if I feel they're ready. But ultimately my goal is to have an overarching theory and kind of, which will evolve into a book. So yeah, that's the plan right now.
Okay, so it's a monograph, but each chapter can be published as a separate article.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. I have I've read the review article that you mentioned before, and I have some specific questions in terms of the art, or in relation to the article. But I think we can continue more with your PhD experience, and then we can take those questions later on, if that is okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. So, I mean, now when you're doing your PhD, what are some of the challenges that you have encountered in the process?
Oh, that's a good question. So one challenge that I've come to appreciate as a PhD student is learning how to adapt, especially when you encounter new learning curves, and there's a level of uncertainty about all kinds of things, especially when you're new to a program. And so questions like how to generate research ideas, understanding the needs of the field or the subfield that you're in, what does a contribution look like? And this can take some time. And this, is generally aided by your advisors and in the community that you're a part of. But just getting a sense of what the literature looks like. How do you know if a research paper will translate into a larger research agenda? Should it? Access to data, feasibility, all of these elements that you encounter when you're being trained to become a researcher, I think can present and be somewhat overwhelming, especially when you're a new PhD student. And there isn't, I think part of it is accepting and understanding that there isn't one neat or straight path to any of these things. And, in some programs, there may not be any one course that's offered to PhD students about how to go about these research and, more professionalization elements of the discipline. And then, on top of that, some students may not have exposure to academia before they enroll in a PhD program, and understanding some of this unwritten curriculum, if you will. So that
Like
can be
me.
a little daunting. Yeah, same. And I know I didn't, and that can appear pretty daunting for PhD students. And of course, this tends to be in addition to your classes, TAing if you begin that early on in a program. And of course, there could be variation with the academy in the US and the academy elsewhere. And so fortunately, there were faculty and community within my department, and even in the broader discipline that I've been fortunate to meet, that have taught me so many of these things. And again, especially if a student doesn't have previous exposure. So Yeah, I'd say that there's certainly overlap, and these are interrelated things. But I think just the challenge and the task of adapting quickly to a lot of these things is something that I found challenging at first,
Hmm.
but I'm so grateful for that experience in retrospect because it doesn't change.
Mm. Mm. I mean, just one thing that I came to think about when you mentioned these things is how to make a contribution. Um, and if we can go back again to the question before, even
Yeah,
though it's not necessarily related to the review piece, but just
sure.
your understanding or your view or your study of R2P.
Mm,
Um, and R2P is, I mean, we have many examples of R2P, but we have some that are more famous than others. For instance, the intervention in Libya, for instance. But a
yes,
lot of but a lot of R2P is not necessarily violent interventions in that sense, or military interventions,
yes,
um, but political interventions,
yes,
or mediation or diplomatic interventions.
sure.
Um, but I would say it's quite easy to make a case for R2P in terms of a liberal internationalist perspective or an
Mm,
English school perspective,
mm,
perhaps the
mhm.
solidarist branch of the English school. And you have some very nice articles critiquing R2P from a realist perspective and so on. But what would your contribution be in terms of R2P? How can we understand this in terms of race?
So there is really great work, I believe, in the international law field
Mhm,
that examines R2P and really rethinks what we think we know about how R2P as a legal concept
mhm,
functions.
mhm,
And so there are authors that suggest that R2P, or this legal principle, essentially it recasts sovereignty, state sovereignty as responsibility. So it's this belief that invents the conditions for intervention in ways that I argue are ultimately racially biased.
mhm,
And this doesn't require individual level racism, unconscious bias. It's not so much this, but it could be more structural in nature, that the patterns of intervention, and you're right, military intervention is not as frequent here. It's more so the invocation of the principle of R2P in the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council within the UN.
mhm,
When is it invoked? Under what conditions is it invoked?
mhm,
So for me, and this is kind of an underlying theme in much of my work, I consider how legal principles like R2P, or whether it's extraterritoriality under SOFA agreements, how there's this kind of underlying projection
mhm,
of deficiency or incapacity, and it tends to be projected onto majority non-white countries.
mhm,
And so the result of this, when it comes to R2P, is that the conditions for invoking R2P are such that they tend to be focused on countries that are lacking capacity,
mhm,
or where there are certain atrocities or things that occur that tend to be only occur in certain countries.
mhm,
And this is a difficult thing to even think about, because in the case of R2P, one would have to look at both cases where the principle is invoked, and then cases where it's not invoked. And so
mhm,
such
mhm,
cases would have to be matched along a variety of dimensions
mhm,
before one would even before one could even approach examining this empirically.
mhm.
And so, but kind of the main thing for
Like
my approach
like the
to RTP,
selectiveness of
yes, oh
invoking it.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes,
yeah. Okay.
absolutely. There's
Mm,
selection problems.
mm,
And so for me, and it is an empirical fact that R2P is pretty much near exclusively invoked towards African countries
mhm,
and non-white populations.
mhm,
And so one would have to examine or take note of this pattern, and then begin to think about some of the reasons that is.
mhm,
And race certainly isn't the only thing, as we've discussed over email. Like there are probably a lot of other indicators and explanations that are important
mhm,
for when this principle is invoked. but controlling for all of these things, does race still matter? Are perceptions of incapacity racialized? And both can be true. And so that's some of the thinking behind how I approach the outcome of R2P and when it's invoked.
Okay. So there you have a solid contribution. So,
well, fingers crossed, I hope.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just really neat to be a part of the conversation. And so much of my approach to this, and even we talked about it a little bit in the review piece, is certainly built upon not just what some IR scholars have discussed about this outcome, but it's really scholars in international law, third world approaches to international law, that have done important thought work on R2P and just this idea of intervention.
Yeah, I think let me just check fast. I remember this piece by I think his name is Adnan Hehir. I don't know if you have heard of him. He wrote an article about R2P called the permanence of inconsistency or something like that. He wrote an interesting piece critiquing R2P and critiquing the intervention in Libya and critiquing how it has been applied in other places as well, from a realist perspective. And I think he published that piece in International Security. So so it would be
I'll look at that.
It would be interesting to see something eventually about race in international security, because that tends to be omitted from that journal. So then you could
and you know that I think to your point, there I think it was scholar Siva Gravogui that wrote, I think it was it might have been Foreign Affairs, or it was another journal or magazine that talked about R2P. And it was so interesting because such an outcome can be racialized in different ways. And I'm only attempting to take one slice of the pie, so to speak. He mentions how one thing to consider is, are there transcripts of world leaders talking about when R2P should be invoked, against whom, in addition, whose expertise is being privileged and leveraged in these debates and conversations. And we know there's empirical evidence that when intervention is proposed in the African context, that is perhaps when African expertise tends to be barred the most. And so there are a number of ways where one can look and maybe suspect that race may be mattering. But again, it would require, it's an empirical question. And so it would require one to theorize in a serious way, and then attempt to, construct a design that maybe captures some of this.
Yeah, I found the article. It's called The Permanence of Inconsistency, Libya, the Security Council, and the Responsibility to Protect in International Security.
Oh, thank you. I don't think I've seen this one.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's, I would say, realist critique of R2P, which I'm quite fond of. So could be something to connect to. But yeah, thank you very much for that elaboration. Very interesting. All right. So yeah, before we finish this part of the interview, so to speak, do you have any recommendations for students contemplating doing a PhD in IR?
Well, so some of this might be geared towards, PhD in political science or IR more generally. But one thing is just becoming more comfortable with uncertainty as it pertains to one's research agenda, to the progress of a research project. There's so many things that are out of one's control. And so I think focusing on the elements that you do have control over, breaking things down into smaller tasks and goals so that you're assuring yourself that you're moving your project forward, that has helped me out tremendously. and not getting too distracted by things that kind of open questions or things that are out of my control or that I'm waiting for. Another thing that I would recommend is, if given the opportunity, so say a student applies to a program and you're accepted, if there's a chance to visit the department and just the campus or the university that you're interested in, I recommend it. I know here in the States, what's common is departments will give open house weekends, and they'll use resources to bring the prospective students that are accepted to the campus so that you can meet the faculty, the current graduate students. There's nothing like experiencing a place for yourself that just, equips you more to make the best decision that you can for what it is that you want as a PhD student.
Unless you apply all over the world, like I did. I applied to countries all over the world. So
yeah,
I couldn't visit the places. Yeah.
Yeah, and no, you're absolutely right. And that's another added element that can also make, ultimately selecting a program challenging at the same time.
Yeah.
Trying to balance all of that. It's, kind of like sensory overload. And, it's more information about the types of departments that one has applied to and been accepted to. So I know that my visit was, I had a clue, but it was pretty decisive for me once I met the faculty and saw how just, I think, content by and large that the grads in my department seemed. Getting to just ask them questions that, the website doesn't answer was really helpful for me. And so, yeah, I'd say if there's an opportunity, you'll, I think, learn much more about a department that you're considering, because you're committing so many years of your life to. I think the next thing, and this could be for new students or students like me that have been in a department for a while or a program for a while, and that is just practically, I try to put my writing first in the day as much as one can with, other obligations and things going on. And so it's really fun when you're engaging in multiple projects and you're co-authoring with people and you might be a part of a research lab. These are all things that I've been involved in that I have just enjoyed and loved, and sometimes would cling to that work before getting back to my own. And so when I set aside time, for me, it's in the morning, first thing to spend some time writing. Sometimes I might write a lot. Sometimes I might, write a sentence, but at least I'm thinking and engaging in the theory of my work and planning for the next step in my work. I found that eases a lot of my nerves and allows me to feel that I'm making progress, even if it's small progress. And then the last thing I'll say is that the PhD really takes a community. There are aspects of the degree that can appear isolating and feel that way because much of the work it's on you, and it's a reflection of you in some ways. However, I found that my work, it hasn't evolved, being isolated or in a vacuum. It's been so nice to rely on others in a way and present, my evolving work in workshops and in smaller meetings and to different faculty. And once I began meeting people outside of my department in the wider discipline, getting to interact and attend workshops with them. And it's just been so nice. And I just have such a profound appreciation for, when I look back on, my second year seminar paper or just my ideas and where I am now. There's, of course, much work still to do, but it's so nice to understand how much it's taken a village. And when I read my work back, I can see the influences and the input and the contributions from so many others that took their time to invest. So.
But some of that must have been hard during the pandemic. I mean, attending workshops, interacting with people, discussing. Okay, of course, we have Zoom
Yes.
but it's not the same thing. I mean, and you started your
No.
PhD during the pandemic, right?
So I was right before. So I started my
Oh,
PhD in 2018. So I had a
okay,
good
okay,
year and a
2018.
half
Mm,
in person out in the real world.
okay.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's something that I hope came up. So in some ways, yes, like not being in person, it was a very different experience, and I felt I had to work a little harder
Mm,
to kind of keep the same engagement and interactions going. But it also, there were some silver linings, I think. So many conferences and smaller workshops became virtual.
yeah, yeah,
So I
yeah,
think that this, for many grad students, maybe junior faculty, um, contingent faculty, so many academics within the university setting,
mm,
this increased accessibility to these types of forums.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. We are
so,
talking now as well. That's also something
right,
perhaps we would
right.
not have done otherwise. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. So I think that in some ways it's been so nice, and ironically, I think this is when I met the most people or formed the most connections
Hmm.
during and after the pandemic, because of it's more accessible for me, things being virtual, or at least having this option, which I
Mm,
like. But I
mm,
am happy to be back in person as well.
mm. All right.
Mm.
Thank you very much for that recommendation. It's also
Mm.
interesting. You said that you start for you. It was in the morning, and you have to write something.
Yeah,
I used to tell myself a paragraph a day at least,
oh,
and then perhaps even if that paragraph was really poor, it was at least a paragraph.
that's
Uh,
right.
but for
That's
me,
right.
it was not in the morning. For me, it was in the middle of the night. So I'm not a morning
Yeah.
person at all, actually. And now when I have children, I'm forced up too early, and it messes up my flow. So
Right. And yeah, and it's just like you said, like, finding the time that works for you. I've found that writing, I'm less clogged with like the news and information and things like that. And in the evenings, I'm somewhat of a night owl as
mm,
well. I'll do more of the R and the data and
mhm,
those types of tasks in the
mhm,
evening.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, whatever works.
yeah. All right.